Lieutenant Ilara Vance did not smell like a soldier. She did not carry the scent of cordite, dust, or ozone that clung to the uniforms of the field-hardened officers who occasionally crossed the threshold of the data citadel. Ilara smelled faintly of ozone from the thousands of servers humming around her and, more profoundly, of sterile, absolute certainty. Her post was deep beneath the sprawling forward command post, FCP-7, in a chamber known, with a touch of morbid reverence, as the God's Eye Room. This was where the chaotic storm of the Ascension War, a grinding conflict defined by brutal logistics and asymmetrical engagement, was distilled into pure, manageable information. Ilara sat at the nexus of it all, her workspace a semicircular cocoon of flickering light, where petabytes of reconnaissance, encrypted chatter, topographical scans, and combat telemetry flowed across her vision like a river of fate. Ilara was a brilliant anomaly. Recruited not from a military academy but from the world of theoretical mathematics and predictive modeling, her mind operated with the dispassionate precision of a high-end supercomputer. For her, war was not a clash of wills or a test of physical endurance, it was the ultimate, complex stochastic equation. Every soldier, every enemy emplacement, every fuel convoy, and every weather pattern was a variable with a corresponding probability of success or failure. Her only mission was to ensure that the probability curve bent inexorably toward victory. This unwavering focus on statistical perfection was her strength, but it was also the root of her isolation. Where field officers relied on instinct, adrenaline, and the blind, glorious commitment to the cause, Ilara relied on the elimination of doubt. She demanded a finality of data that the messy, organic reality of war could rarely provide. She sought the 100% certainty, and if any analysis, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, brought that figure down to 99.99%, she would halt a million-credit operation without a flicker of remorse. She often worked in silence so profound it felt oppressive, punctuated only by the subtle whir of cooling fans and the rhythmic, coded ping of incoming satellite bursts. She wasn't cold, she was saturated with logic. The weight of every life she was theoretically saving or sacrificing through her projections was so immense that she had compartmentalized emotion entirely, leaving only the bedrock of her mathematical training to hold the line. For Ilara, an error wasn't a mistake, it was a catastrophe multiplier. The Ascension War was a conflict unlike any the forces had fought before. It wasn't about holding territory or grand flanking maneuvers, it was a war of attrition, deception, and hyperlocalized targeting. The enemy, referred to simply as the Syndicate, fought with brutal, almost suicidal aggression, prioritizing immediate tactical destruction over long-term strategic integrity. This style of warfare demanded a corresponding military culture of immediate, unquestioning aggression. The prevailing philosophy among the field commanders was simple: if you have a 60% chance of success and you wait for a better one, the 40% chance of failure will find you first. Action was prized. Hesitation was treason. It was this culture that cemented Ilara's infamous nickname, the Zero. The name originated from an incident during the initial push into the Red Sector. A small, crucial infiltration team needed a window of precisely 4 minutes for extraction before an unpredictable orbital laser sweep would sterilize their area. Ilara was tasked with providing the go-ahead based on the Syndicate's known patrol patterns and reaction times. Her predictive model returned a 99.98% certainty that the window was secure. The other 2 analysts at her station greenlit the window immediately. It was as close to a sure thing as war allowed. Ilara did not. She spotted the 0.02% outlier, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the enemy's acoustic signature near a geothermal vent, suggesting a newly deployed acoustic sensor array that could potentially cut the 4-minute window to 3. If the team was still on the ground when that sensor was activated, they would be flash-fried by the orbital strike. "Wait," she'd said, her voice flat. "The probability of detection is 0.02, based on the non-standard deployment of the Alpha 9 transducer. We hold." The field commander, Colonel Ricks, had exploded. "Vance, you have a 99.98% chance. What is wrong with you? Move it." Ilara had simply replied, "Colonel, 0.02 is not 0. They waited. The window closed. The team was extracted 2 days later via a much more expensive, resource-draining operation, but they lived. The mission, however, was a failure. Rix had later stomped into the data citadel, his face crimson, and pointed a mud-caked glove at Ilara. "She's the zero," he'd snarled. "The coward who can't pull the trigger on a sure thing because she's scared of a decimal point. She'd rather lose a war than risk a 0.02 casualty count." The name stuck. It wasn't just a slight against her caution, it was a profound cultural condemnation. In a war demanding absolute commitment, she prioritized preservation over proficiency. In a world of fire, she lived by the wire. Ilara's physical presence mirrored her internal state. She was lean, almost ascetic, with hair pulled back so severely it emphasized the sharp, intellectual angles of her face. Her uniform was always impeccable, devoid of the minor scuffs and wear that denoted real work. She was an outsider in the truest sense, and she knew it. The men and women of the FCP-7 saw her as a luxury, a high-cost overhead who dealt in abstractions while they dealt in death. This isolation forced her into an intense, almost philosophical relationship with her work. The numbers weren't just data streams, they were the raw currency of human existence. When she ran a simulation, she didn't just see colored blocks on a map, she saw the potential outcomes, a mother receiving a medal or a child receiving a folded flag. To allow a 0.02% chance of catastrophe was to permit a possibility she had the power to nullify. Her job, as she defined it, was to bring probability down to impossible certainty, even if it meant refusing to act. She had no friends in the FCP-7, only colleagues who tolerated her necessary function. Their pity and their barely concealed contempt was a constant, cold pressure. They saw her perfect logic as a shield against true bravery. They believed she feared the consequences of failure so much that she chose the failure of inaction instead. They assumed she was paralyzed by the weight of decision. They did not understand that her paralysis was actually the highest form of velocity. In the moment of decision, while others were reacting on instinct, Ilara was running thousands of counter-simulations, extrapolating failure paths, and cross-referencing uncorrelated datasets. The pause they mistook for fear was actually a furious, internal calculation, often more exhausting than a 10-mile forced march. She was making a definitive choice, a choice of survival over immediate glory, a choice that only her isolated mind could execute without the contamination of human hope or fear. She was ready to wear the label of coward. She wore the moniker the Zero like a lead apron, knowing that it protected her from the one thing that truly terrified her, the catastrophic error that 100% of the data missed. She waited, silently, for the one moment when her unique calculus would be tested not just against a general mission, but against the very essence of military duty itself. That moment, though she did not know it yet, was fast approaching at a place called the Bottleneck Bridge. The Bottleneck Bridge, officially designated Crossing Point Gamma 3, was a scar of rusted steel and deteriorating concrete that spanned the river Styx, a churning, glacially fed waterway marking the definitive border between Allied territory and the Syndicate's fortified zone. Its nickname, the Bottleneck, was grimly accurate. It was the only route capable of supporting heavy armored personnel carriers, APCs, for 20 kilometers in either direction. For the current mission, Operation Stiletto, it was the arterial pinch point. Operation Stiletto was not about conquest, it was about precision. A highly specialized reconnaissance team, designated Ghost Cell, had slipped past Syndicate defenses and infiltrated a key communications hub. They had acquired a data core containing the enemy's next 6 months of projected logistics. Their success hinged entirely on getting that data core out and the Ghost Cell out alive. The extraction window was closing rapidly, not because of enemy pursuit, which was expected and handled by their diversionary teams, but because a massive, unpredictable cryostorm was sweeping in from the west. Once the storm hit, all air extraction was impossible, and the window would slam shut for days, allowing the Syndicate to discover the breach and encrypt the stolen data. The extraction plan relied on a single, heavy-duty APC, the Ironclad, to cross the Bottleneck Bridge, rendezvous with the Ghost Cell just on the far bank, and sprint back before the stormfront arrived. Speed and unwavering compliance were non-negotiable. In the God's Eye room, Ilara's station was flashing red. Major Zorn, the commander in charge of the extraction unit, was 5 minutes from the crossing point, his voice a tight coil of tension. "Vance, Give me the structural integrity green light, Zorn demanded over the open channel. The bridge was rated a yellow 2 days ago. Give me green go for the weight class. Ilara stared at the main structural display. Her primary monitor showed the standard structural assessment provided by the Military Engineering Corps. It displayed a 94% stress rating, safe, but barely. Her colleagues in the room were already shouting confirmations. Green, Lieutenant. Green. Move the payload. But Ilara's gaze was fixed not on the large, comprehensive structural model, but on a separate, proprietary sensor feed she had ordered installed weeks ago, near the foundation of the bridge's massive central pier. This feed monitored microseismic and hydrostatic pressure data, the minute, non-obvious forces that could betray geological instability or hidden tampering. The data she was seeing was irrelevant to the structural integrity of the steel. The steel would hold the ironclad. But the data was screaming about the geological integrity of the riverbed supporting the steel. The feed showed a minuscule oscillation in the hydrostatic pressure, a deviation so small it would be dismissed by any automated system as river turbulence or thermal variation. This single data point was the ghost in the machine. It didn't mean the bridge was about to collapse, it meant something was disturbing the foundation that shouldn't be disturbed. In the chaotic symphony of war data, this oscillation was a single, off-key violin note. Ilara's internal world accelerated to 1,000 times real-time. She was running a rapid extrapolation sequence, attempting to correlate the micro-oscillation with known enemy capabilities. Hypothesis 1, standard natural river currents and minor erosion. Probability, 99.9%. Conclusion, go. Hypothesis 2, military risk structural fatigue exacerbated by recent shelling. Probability, 0.05%. Conclusion, go, but proceed with caution. Hypothesis 3, Ilara's outlier. The oscillation is caused by a submerged, high-density mass being rapidly deployed or shifted at the riverbed, perfectly camouflaged by the turbidity of the water. This last hypothesis was the nightmare scenario. If the syndicate had not only anticipated the extraction but actively prepared the bridge as a kill zone, they wouldn't use simple explosives. They would use a massive, delayed kinetic strike, a charge designed not to destroy the bridge, but to destabilize the central pier, causing a controlled, timed collapse under a precise load. They didn't want a damaged bridge, they wanted a permanently blocked choke point, and the destruction of the high-value transport. She ran a quick simulation. If Hypothesis 3 was true, the weight of the ironclad at the apex of the bridge would trigger a controlled detonation of a charge designed to create a cascading geological failure in the bedrock. The ironclad would drop into the churning river, along with the Ghost Cell team and the irreplaceable data core. The certainty of a successful, mission-saving extraction if she gave the go was 99.99%. She could not, in the eyes of any sane military mind, justify prioritizing the 0.01% chance of catastrophe. Major Zorn's voice was ragged now. Vance. I'm at the approach. The storm is hitting the ridge line. We lose the window in 60 seconds. Give me the go, damn it. Every synapse in Ilara's brain screamed the same fact. 0.01 is not zero. It was enough. In that single, defining moment, she made the conscious, agonizing choice. She chose the certainty of mission failure over the 0.01% chance of complete, irreparable catastrophe. The truth was not that she froze from fear, but that her mind moved too fast, calculating a cost the others couldn't see. She hit the hold switch. The light on the bridge status display remained stubbornly, defiantly red. Vance. What is your problem? Zorn's voice dissolved into a roar of betrayal. You just killed the mission. You just sacrificed the intelligence. This is treason. Ilara spoke, her voice still measured, though a cold sweat had broken out on her back. Major Zorn, hold at the approach. Proceed to secondary extraction point Delta 9. Route calculation rerouted to your display. Delta 9 is a 2-hour detour, you idiot. We'll be buried in snow before we're halfway there. It is a viable route, Major. The bridge is compromised. Zorn didn't respond immediately. The silence was thick and hostile. He finally transmitted, understood. Proceeding to Delta 9. But let the record show, Lieutenant, You broke protocol and doomed this mission on a gut feeling. The extraction, via Delta 9, was successful 2.5 hours later, just as the cryostorm hit. The Ghost Cell team was safe. However, the stolen data core, which required constant, high-power decryption, was lost when the storm disrupted their communication relay for 45 minutes, allowing the Syndicate's automated defense protocols to remotely wipe the core clean. The mission log was unambiguous: failure due to analytical delay and subsequent refusal to authorize crossing at Gamma 3 by Lieutenant E. Vance. The repercussions were instantaneous and brutal. Ilara was immediately escorted from the data citadel and confined to quarters. The whispers turned to shouts. The analysts who had backed the 99.99% certainty felt betrayed and foolish, projecting their anger onto her. The field officers, facing a strategic setback, saw her as the ultimate liability. They hadn't seen a calculation, they had seen a coward. Major Zorn's official report was damning, concluding with a line that cut through the military bureaucracy and stuck to Ilara like mud. Lieutenant Vance exhibited a crippling paralysis when faced with a critical decision, prioritizing minute statistical outliers over necessary aggressive action. Her refusal cost the campaign vital intelligence and validated her unofficial designation as the coward of the bridge. Her rank was temporarily suspended. The official censure stripped her of all commendations and placed her under mandatory review. The isolation she had chosen in the data citadel was now a public, agonizing reality. She was an object of scorn, confined to the claustrophobic silence of her small room, waiting for the tribunal. She had saved lives, yes, but in the brutal calculus of war, she had failed the mission, and therefore, she had failed the command. The High Command Tribunal chamber was not built for comfort or negotiation, it was constructed for finality. It was a vast, circular room known as the Ring of Judgment, clad in polished basalt and dark, silent wood. The only light came from a single, high oculus in the ceiling, casting a merciless, theatrical spotlight onto the center where the accused stood, a stark, exposed figure against the shadows. Ilara Vance, stripped of her temporary rank insignia, stood precisely on the central marker, feeling less like a soldier and more like a mathematical hypothesis awaiting invalidation. The room was packed with the military elite, analysts, logistics officers, and, crucially, field commanders who whispered judgments based on the immediate loss of the data core. To them, she was a symbol of intellectual cowardice, the fear of engagement dressed up in the lab coat of academia. Presiding over the 5-officer panel, situated on a slightly raised dais, was General Darius Thorne. Thorne was more than a general, he was an institution, a myth forged in the crucible of a dozen campaigns. He was the man who had ordered the charge of the ice fields, a maneuver deemed suicidal by strategists but which had decisively broken a critical enemy blockade. His face was a testament to his service, hard-lined, deeply tanned, and dominated by 2 eyes the color of cold steel that seemed capable of dissecting intention at 50 paces. General Thorne embodied the very virtue Ilara was accused of lacking: unflinching decisiveness. His courage was kinetic, Ilara's was theoretical. Thorne was the hammer of the military, Ilara was the unseen lever. He viewed hesitation as a disease, a virus that could spread from one commander to contaminate an entire offensive. His very presence was a condemnation of her 3 seconds of silence at the bottleneck bridge. He did not speak during the initial proceedings, observing Ilara with a cold, almost anthropological detachment that was far more unnerving than any anger. He seemed to be calculating her value: was she a brilliant, but broken, instrument, or merely a statistical mistake that needed to be zeroed out? The lead prosecutor, Colonel Varick, was a man of straightforward, devastating rhetoric. He did not engage with Ilara's complex data streams or the philosophical debate over risk aversion. He kept his case brutally simple, relying on 2 foundational pillars of military law: command authority and mission priority. The defense attempts to introduce complex, speculative counterdata regarding a micro-oscillation and a hypothetical kinetic charge, Varick began, his voice resonating against the cold stone. But this tribunal must disregard the labyrinth of possibility and return to the simple truth of the mission. He slammed his hand onto the podium, the sound echoing through the room. The simple truth is this: Ghost Cell acquired irreplaceable intelligence. Mission priority was extraction. Lieutenant Vance was given a clear order to greenlight the fastest extraction route, a route confirmed as 99.99% stable by 3 other senior analysts. She defied that order. Her refusal, based on a 0.01% statistical anomaly, directly led to a 2-hour delay and the subsequent loss of the entire data core. In the military, we do not reward paralysis. We reward action. Varick presented the official mission log, highlighting Major Zorn's damning conclusion: failure due to analytical delay and subsequent refusal to authorize crossing at Gamma 3. Lieutenant Vance did not save a ship, she lost the treasure. She did not save the campaign, she allowed the enemy 6 months of predictive capability. She had the chance to be the hero, but she chose to be the zero, Varick concluded, his voice dripping with finality. She failed the primary objective. She failed her command. And in doing so, she exhibited a lack of the essential courage required of her rank. The weight of the accusation was crushing. It was unassailable. Ilara's counsel, a nervous, junior officer, could only offer weak counterarguments about her previous service record and the intent of preservation, arguments that bounced harmlessly off the granite face of the mission logs. The formal proceedings wound down, the verdict a foregone conclusion. The panel members shifted in their seats, ready to receive the general's final instruction before they retired to deliberate the appropriate punitive action, likely a full dishonorable discharge. General Thorne, however, had not moved. He silenced the nervous closing remarks of Ilara's counsel with a brief, dismissive hand gesture. He pushed his chair back, the harsh scrape of metal on stone the loudest sound in the room. He descended from the dais, his polished boots making only the faintest tap on the basalt floor as he walked straight toward Ilara. He stopped directly in front of her, his imposing figure casting her in shadow. He didn't look at the data, the logs, or the prosecutor. He looked only at Ilara Vance, scanning her eyes for the flinch, the regret, the telltale sign of a broken will. Lieutenant Vance, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast room. It was not the voice of a judge, but of an old soldier asking a fundamental question of war. I have heard the data. I have heard the percentages. I have heard the mission reports, he stated, cutting through the entire legal and analytical framework. But none of it speaks to will. It speaks to fear. He leaned in slightly, his intensity demanding a visceral response. He disregarded the censure, the protocol, and the entire weight of the tribunal. He made it personal. He made it about the only thing that mattered to him: courage. Why did you let us down, Lieutenant? General Thorne asked, his final question simple, blunt, and designed to cut to the bone of her shame. Why did you fail us? General Thorne's final question, why did you fail us, was not a rhetorical challenge from a judge, it was a demand for accountability from the very soul of the military ethos. It bypassed all the data streams, all the protocols, and all the mathematical justifications. It left Lieutenant Ilara Vance standing naked before the concept of courage itself. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but a tangible, physical pressure. It was the collective held breath of 50 high-ranking officers waiting for the final, expected confession, an admission of fear, a plea for leniency, or perhaps a sudden, emotional torrent of self-defense. They were waiting for the crack in the Zero's armor. Ilara did none of these things. She simply stood, her shoulders squared, her gaze locked on the general. Her mind, however, was not blank. It was doing what it always did, calculating the minimum effective variable. She knew, with the clarity of her predictive models, that any explanation, any complex narrative involving microseismic readings, hydrostatic shifts, and delayed kinetic charges would be dismissed. Thorne had already signaled his rejection of data complexity. He was searching for truth distilled to its purest form. She allowed the silence to stretch. In her perception, this moment lasted an eternity, the time it took for the faint beam of light from the oculus to move a single millimeter across the polished basalt floor. She felt the heavy, expectant eyes of the panel, the cynical satisfaction of Colonel Varick, and the sheer, unyielding demand in General Thorne's posture. She knew her reply could not be a defense of herself. General Thorne stood mere inches from Ilara, his shadow engulfing her smaller frame. His impatience was starting to show in the minute tightening of his jaw. He was waiting for the final surrender. Then, Ilara spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion, echoing once off the high dome of the Ring of Judgment. It was a single, perfect utterance, a word that contained the entire, complex calculus of her decision, and yet, was entirely comprehensible to every soldier in the room. Foreknowledge. The effect was instantaneous and profound, like a sudden, percussive blast in a silent cave. It was not the word they expected. They expected fear, or protocol, or perhaps doubt. They did not expect a word that implied not inaction, but superior, proactive intelligence. Colonel Varick's mouth, poised for a sneering retort, snapped shut. The panel members looked at each other, momentarily thrown off balance. It was a lawyer's word, an analyst's word, but uttered under these circumstances, it was an accusation against the very men who judged her. General Thorne, the legendary commander, experienced a physical reaction. His shoulders, which had been set in a rigid posture of dominance, fractionally recoiled. His cold, steel-grey eyes widened just slightly. Thorne was a man of action, but he was not a fool. He knew that simple courage often failed against complex traps. He understood the profound, unspoken claim of that one word: "I didn't fail you out of fear. I knew something you did not." General Thorne did not wait for Colonel Varick to object, nor did he consult the panel. He took one step back, processing the word. Foreknowledge. It was the opposite of paralysis. It implied a deliberate, calculated, and highly courageous choice of cost, the loss of the data core, over catastrophe, the loss of the mission and the team. Thorne did something entirely unprecedented. He raised a hand, silencing the entire room, and addressed Ilara, no longer as a defendant, but as a peer engaged in a tactical debriefing. "Explain that word, Lieutenant," Thorne commanded, his voice now lower, rougher, edged with an intense curiosity that replaced his earlier condemnation. "Explain to me how a 0.01% anomaly gives you foreknowledge of a tactical threat that our entire intelligence matrix missed." Ilara finally moved. She lifted her head, and for the first time since the mission failure, she allowed a spark of intellectual fire to illuminate her eyes. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to bypass the emotional court of opinion and present her evidence to the one mind capable of understanding its terrifying precision. "General, the mission failed because the Syndicate intended for us to succeed," Ilara stated, her voice regaining the clarity of her data citadel environment. "The ironclad was never meant to cross the bottleneck bridge. It was meant to block it." She then initiated the external display, a rogue function her junior counsel had prepared in the hope of a Hail Mary defense. The massive screen behind the dais flickered to life, showing not a battlefield map, but a complex, three-dimensional hydrological model of the river Styx beneath the bottleneck bridge. "My anomaly was a hydrostatic oscillation," Ilara continued, pointing to a small, churning vortex in the digital rendering. "A riverbed sensor reported a pressure differential consistent with a high-mass object descending and stabilizing near the central pier 3 hours before the ghost cell extraction window opened. Our analysts dismissed it as turbulence. The micro-oscillation was not the trigger, General," Ilara said, her voice rising slightly with the sheer logic of the proof. "It was the confirmation. The Syndicate had deployed a kinetic torpedo, a delayed charge, not to blow up the bridge, but to destabilize the entire riverbed foundation at the exact moment the maximum stress, the ironclad's weight, was applied." She displayed the catastrophic simulation, the ironclad cresting the bridge, the kinetic charge detonating 100 meters below the riverbed, the resulting flash liquefaction of the supporting silt, and the massive, permanent collapse of the central pier. The room gasped, a sound of horror that was immediately swallowed by Thorne's intense focus. "The Syndicate's objective was not the data core," Ilara concluded, her voice returning to its calm, factual pitch. "It was to permanently destroy crossing point Gamma 3. Had Major Zorn crossed, he would have blocked the single heavy transport route for the next 8 months, effectively bifurcating our entire southern advance. The data core was bait. My single word, foreknowledge, is the mathematical proof that by prioritizing the 0.01% anomaly, I sacrificed a few months of intelligence to save the entire strategic timeline of the Southern Command." She fell silent. The general did not look at the screen, which showed the terrifying, water-filled doom of the ironclad in vivid detail. He looked only at the lieutenant, who had worn the title of coward for a choice that, he now realized, was an act of extraordinary, intellectual self-sacrifice. General Darius Thorne remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Alara Vance, even as the catastrophic, animated simulation of the sinking ironclad replayed silently on the screen behind the dais. The simulated splash of the heavy APC hitting the churning digital river was the sound of his entire worldview shattering. Thorne was a man who lived and breathed in percentages above 90. Risk was inherent in war, but it was calculated risk, never catastrophic risk. His genius lay in his ability to identify a 60% chance of success and push it to 100% through sheer, unrelenting force of will. Now, Alara had shown him the single point of failure hidden in the 0.01%, a variable so minute, so intellectually counterintuitive, that the entire Southern Command system, from the sensors to the analysts to the legendary general himself, had not only missed it but had condemned the one mind that saw it. His internal reckoning was immediate and brutal. The Syndicate had not merely set a trap, they had weaponized the Allied command structure's inherent bias toward aggression. They knew the intelligence was crucial. They knew the extraction window was tight. They relied entirely on the immediacy of necessary action, blinding the officers to the complexity of necessary caution. They had anticipated the pressure, anticipated the overriding priority, and anticipated that no one would dare look at the 0.01%. Thorne slowly turned his head to the screen. The simulation showed the riverbed silt turning to liquid beneath the bridge pier moments after the ironclad engaged. The collapse was not an explosive event, but a geological sinkhole, silent, unstoppable, and designed to leave the bridge permanently, structurally ruined for months. It wasn't about killing a team, it was about ensuring tactical stagnation. I would have ordered the go, the realization struck Thorne with the force of a physical blow. I would have signed the death warrant for the entire Southern advance. He felt a sudden, sickening disconnect from the reputation that preceded him, the man who never hesitated. His famed decisiveness, in this single instance, would have been the greatest failure of his career. The only thing separating victory from paralysis was this one quiet lieutenant, whom he had just been ready to destroy for cowardice. Alara's silence during the mission, her refusal to follow the 99.99% protocol, was now revealed as the most profound act of strategic obedience imaginable. She had obeyed the higher directive, preserve the campaign structure at all costs. She had understood that the price of the data core, and the mission failure that followed its loss, was astronomically lower than the price of a bifurcated front line and the destruction of the main transport route. Colonel Varick, the lead prosecutor, finally attempted to speak, his voice a pathetic squeak of protest. "General, this is a post facto rationalization. She has provided no evidence the Syndicate could have executed this." Thorne didn't look at him. He raised his hand, not in anger, but in utter dismissal. "Colonel," he stated, his voice now flat and heavy, "Lieutenant Vance has provided the single most compelling piece of intelligence this command has received in a month. The complexity of the threat matches no known Syndicate protocol except their Phase 3 counterlogistics doctrine, which we dismissed as theoretical. Vance identified a Phase 3 signature in a sensor feed that none of you were even aware existed." He walked back to the dais, but did not sit. He addressed the silent room, his voice taking on the commanding tone of a man delivering a field eulogy to a lost battalion. "We trained Lieutenant Vance to be the pinnacle of analytical intelligence," Thorne said, sweeping his gaze across the panel members who now averted their eyes in shame. "We taught her that the only truth in war is the data. But when her data, her foreknowledge, contradicted the easy, emotional path of courage and action, what did we do? We didn't listen. We didn't investigate. We condemned her as a coward for choosing failure over catastrophe." He paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air. Her choice was not a failure of nerve. It was the absolute, unyielding courage to accept personal dishonor, loss of rank, and public shame for the sake of a strategic victory she could not, in that moment, articulate or prove. This, General Thorne realized, was the true moral cost of Alara's obedience. She had chosen to absorb the mission failure, the zero, into her own reputation, rather than risk the 0.01% chance of a disaster that would destroy the lives of Major Zorn's team and the momentum of the entire war. She had effectively placed her own career as a shield against the syndicate's trap, knowing that the institutional bias against her analytical prudence would guarantee her personal ruin. In the old definition of courage, a soldier charged the machine gun nest. In Ilara's new calculus, courage was the will to stand still when every fiber of military expectation demanded movement. It was the self-control to accept the label of traitor when the data dictated preservation. Thorne looked at Ilara one last time. Her face was still calm, but now it was clear the calmness was not apathy, it was the exhaustion of a mind that had borne a terrifying, singular truth alone. He reached for the communications console on the dais, a piece of equipment usually reserved for issuing deployment orders. He spoke into the microphone, his voice resonating across the entire command structure. "This tribunal is suspended," General Thorne announced. "The finding of the tribunal is officially placed on immediate and indefinite hold. Effective immediately, Major Zorn's operational report on the failure of Operation Stiletto is rescinded. All censure and disciplinary action against Lieutenant E. Vance is terminated." The room remained absolutely silent. This was not a reprieve, it was a revolution. Thorne was tearing up the entire legal framework of the last 3 weeks with a single order. "Colonel Varick," Thorne continued, his voice sharp, "you will lead an immediate, deep-sea exploration of crossing point Gamma 3. You will confirm the existence of the Syndicate kinetic torpedo. Lieutenant Vance will be assigned as your lead tactical and geological advisor." Thorne finally stepped back, his posture now straightened not by military discipline, but by a powerful sense of humbling respect. He had seen the raw, kinetic courage of the front line many times. Today, he had witnessed the cold, enduring courage of the mind. The ultimate confrontation was over, but the final, public act of judgment had yet to be delivered. The air in the ring of judgment was thick, not with the smoke of battle, but with the cold, cutting clarity of exposed error. General Thorne's voice, having delivered the command that simultaneously tore up a court-martial and vindicated an accused, ceased. The sudden silence that returned was profound. It was the silence of men who had just seen their most cherished, unexamined assumptions about courage and duty proven catastrophically wrong. Colonel Varick, the prosecutor, looked less like a legal adversary and more like a civilian who had stumbled onto a live firing range. "The General's order, you will confirm the existence of the Syndicate kinetic torpedo. Lieutenant Vance will be assigned as your lead tactical and geological advisor," was not merely a reassignment, it was a public humiliation. Thorne had forced Varick to become the chief investigator of his own flawed prosecution, supervised by the very woman he had called the Zero. Ilara Vance, however, showed no trace of triumph. She did not look at Varick, nor at the ashamed faces of the tribunal panel who now fidgeted with their pens and paperwork. Her focus remained on General Thorne. She had successfully delivered the data point, and the data point had been accepted. Her emotional state was not one of relief, but of deep, professional exhaustion. The weight of carrying the foreknowledge, the terrible certainty that she had saved the Southern advance at the cost of her reputation, was finally lifting, leaving behind a cold, empty quiet. Thorne, recognizing this deep fatigue, did not push for more dialogue. He understood that she had already given everything, including her honor, to her service. He knew that for Ilara, the termination of the censure was the only reward she truly needed, for it confirmed the integrity of her work. General Thorne slowly, deliberately descended the 2 steps from the dais, his eyes never leaving Ilara Vance. He stopped the same distance away from her as before, but the dynamic had irrevocably changed. The space between them was no longer a judge-to-accused gap, but a space of shared, terrifying insight into the nature of true command. He did not offer a handshake, a verbal apology, or a promotion. Those were the easy, conventional tokens of recompense. Thorne knew that Ilara's sacrifice required an acknowledgement of greater substance, one that spoke directly to the entire military establishment watching and waiting for the final, official word. He stood taller, drawing himself to his full, imposing height. Then, with a slow, powerful motion that captivated every eye in the room, General Thorne raised his right hand. The general, who received salutes from 3-star officers and above, executed a perfect, formal salute to the lieutenant standing accused. It was an act of profound, silent communication. A general salutes a subordinate only in circumstances of extreme, historical recognition, to honor a posthumous medal, or to acknowledge an act of heroism that transcends rank. This gesture bypassed the rank structure entirely. It was one mind saluting another will. It was General Thorne's public confession that Elara Vance's courage of inaction was superior to his own courage of action. The salute was crisp, held for 5 long, immutable seconds, acknowledging the depth of her moral calculus. It confirmed that she had not been a coward, but a guardian, a strategist willing to accept the shame of a zero to prevent a total strategic loss. It was the ultimate, irrefutable validation of her one-word reply, foreknowledge. When Thorne lowered his hand, he looked Elara in the eye. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than any citation. Elara Vance, ever the soldier, returned the salute with the practiced, precise snap of her own hand. It was an exchange that closed the loop on the entire agonizing ordeal. She had been called a coward, she had replied with a word that held the entire truth, and the highest authority had accepted that truth, publicly acknowledging her as a strategic savior. Thorne's salute reverberated immediately through the command structure. By the time Elara had walked out of the ring of judgment, not through the side door for the disgraced, but through the central, main exit, her status had already transformed. The whispers of coward were replaced by the hushed tones of the guardian, the analyst whose foresight had saved the Southern Command from crippling tactical stagnation. Within a week, Colonel Varick's deep-sea exploration confirmed the finding. A massive, syndicate-designed kinetic torpedo armed and ready was recovered from the precise location Elara's 0.01% anomaly had indicated. The evidence was irrefutable. Lieutenant Vance was immediately promoted to captain and appointed to a newly created, highly specialized role, Chief of Predictive Analysis and Counterlogistics. Her new mandate was simple: to actively hunt the statistical shadows that the military's aggressive mindset routinely overlooked. Elara never spoke of the tribunal again. She never used the story for personal gain or glory. For her, the reward was not the rank or the title, it was the profound knowledge that in the moment of greatest pressure, she had trusted the data, maintained her integrity, and saved the lives of her countrymen. Her legend became a powerful new lesson taught in command schools. Courage is not always the charge, sometimes, courage is the stillness. It is the willingness to be condemned by the short-sighted many for the preservation of the long-term truth. The memory of her one-word reply, followed by the general's salute, became the new, defining standard for intellectual bravery in the theater of war. The saga of Captain Elara Vance was not merely a change in one officer's fortunes, it triggered a systemic earthquake in military doctrine. General Thorne, profoundly chastened and awakened by the experience, became Elara's fiercest and most powerful advocate. He recognized that the greatest enemy was not the syndicate, but the institutional momentum that favored blunt action over subtle intelligence. The Vance Protocol was born, swiftly integrated into every command school and tactical decision matrix. It mandated that any intelligence officer, regardless of rank, could halt a mission with a single, coded word, that word being foreknowledge, if they could provide evidence of a critical, missed anomaly. The protocol itself was an act of extreme command vulnerability, forcing senior officers to pause, listen, and question their own bias toward action. It fundamentally redefined courage not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to exercise intellectual sovereignty against immense pressure. Recruitment shifted dramatically. The military's legendary focus on battlefield heroes broadened to include the statistical savants, the quiet, relentless minds capable of seeing patterns in the noise. The data citadel, once a ridiculed, isolated facility, was physically moved to the immediate vicinity of the General Command headquarters. The zero was no longer a slur, it was a badge of honor for the analysts who dealt in absolute precision. For General Thorne, the episode was the ultimate trial by fire. He had been given the chance to live up to the myth of his own legend by admitting his fallibility. He ensured the historical record of the event was not flattering to himself or the tribunal panel. He forced the institution to confront its own failure, understanding that true leadership meant creating a system where the most critical truth could rise from the lowest ranks, even if that truth condemned his own judgment. Thorne's final act concerning the incident was to commission a bronze plaque, placed discreetly outside the ring of judgment. It contained only 2 words, foreknowledge and stillness, a constant, silent reminder to every officer who entered the hallowed hall that a single word of caution, born of true integrity, could outweigh the clamor of 1,000 orders. He and Alara Vance maintained a distant, professional relationship defined by deep, mutual respect. They were, in a strange way, the 2 halves of modern warfare, the kinetic force that acted, and the calculated pause that preserved. Captain Vance herself remained firmly in the shadows, perfectly content to be the guardian of the statistical edge. She never sought the spotlight, the interviews, or the celebrity that her status could have afforded. Her office was still sparse, dominated by multi-screen displays of flickering data streams. Yet, every now and then, when a young, eager officer assigned to her unit would ask about the infamous trial, she would simply point to the general's salute pinned discreetly on her wall, a small, printed photograph. "They called me a coward," she would say, her eyes fixed on the data. "But in the end, they asked the right question. And the truth, once acknowledged, always sets the strategy free." The war continued, but it was fought smarter, slower, and with a profound new respect for the power of the infinitesimal. The noise of aggression still dominated the battlefield, but deep within command, there was always a pocket of stillness, protected by a captain who had taught a general that the bravest thing a soldier could do was, sometimes, nothing at all.